Chairman McCall, we welcome your testimony.
Thank you, Chairman, ranking member, members of the committee. Let me just say first that I wish we did not have to be here tonight. But more than 3 years after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, President Biden, Vice President Harris have yet to hold a single person accountable for this catastrophic failure of epic proportions. When asked just this month if there had been any accountability for the disastrous withdrawal, National Security Advisor Kirby responded, quote, "We've all held ourselves accountable," end of quote. That answer doesn't fool anybody. If the administration refuses to hold itself accountable, then the duly elected representatives of the American people must. In April 2021, the president announced the Biden-Harris administration would withdraw from Afghanistan. They ignored the Taliban's violations of the Doha Agreement. They ignored objections by our nation's military and intelligence experts. They ignored objections by our NATO allies. The Biden-Harris administration was determined to withdraw from Afghanistan no matter what the cost. According to their own admission, the Doha Agreement was, quote, immaterial, end of quote, to that decision. Following President Biden's go-to-zero order, the Taliban captured province after province. Meanwhile, thanks to this administration's feckless policy, there were less than 1,000 U.S. troops on the ground, and our Afghan allies suffered unsustainable losses. All the while, this administration did nothing to plan an emergency evacuation while denying the threats to Americans' interest, American citizens, and our decade-long Afghan partners. So on August 15, 2021, Kabul fell, and the administration's utter failure to prepare became painfully clear. As my report revealed, the Biden-Harris administration had the information and opportunity to take the necessary steps to plan for the inevitable collapse of the Afghan government. But at each step of the way, they prioritized optics, political optics, over the security of brave Americans. To protect their partisan aims, the administration proffered our service members, diplomats, citizens, and allies on a silver platter to the Taliban and ISIS-K. The Biden-Harris administration treated the Taliban, a terrorist group, as security partners during the evacuation. They created the environment that allowed an ISIS-K terrorist to pass through a Taliban checkpoint. Think about that, a Taliban checkpoint. We put the Taliban in charge. And on August 26, 2021, that terrorist detonated his bomb, murdering 13 U.S. service members and over 170 Afghan civilians and injuring 45 American service members. It was the deadliest day for the U.S. military in Afghanistan since 2012, and it never should have happened. Rather than own up to their mistakes, this administration touts their deadly evacuation as a success. I believe that's shameful. Today, U.S. national security is degraded. Americans' credibility on the world stage is damaged, and the moral injury to Americans, veterans, and service members is a stain on this administration's credibility and legacy. When I became a chairman, I launched the investigation so that we, Congress, and the American people could work to ensure that what happened in Afghanistan never happens again. And as everyone here knows, we cannot begin to fix a problem without first admitting that there is a problem. That is what accountability is all about. My 353-page report on this investigation works to provide that accountability. So we take the first step in fixing the problem by holding accountable those leaders who are derelict in their duties and are responsible for this disaster. They are Joseph Biden, President of the United States, Kamala Harris, Vice President of the United States, Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor. Jonathan Feiner, Assistant to the President and Deputy National Security Advisor. Elizabeth Sherwood Randall, Assistant to the President for Homeland Security and Deputy National Security Advisor. John Kirby, National Security Spokesman and former Defense Department spokesman. Jen Psaki, former White House Press Secretary. Anthony Blinken, U.S. Secretary of State. Brian McKeon, former Deputy Secretary of State. Ross Wilson, U.S. Ambassador and former Chief of Mission to the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. Zalmay Khalilzad, U.S. Ambassador and former Special Representative for Afghanistan Reconciliation. Ned Price, Deputy to the U.S. Representative to the United Nations and former State Department spokesman. Lloyd Austin, U.S. Secretary of Defense. Derek Chollet, Chief of Staff to Secretary Austin and former counselor to Secretary Blinken. And Colin Kahl, former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. The American people, U.S. service members, veterans, and the Gold Star families who recently received the Congressional Gold Medal here in the Capitol deserve both transparency and accountability. Those who support this resolution will deliver both. This will serve as a productive step towards ensuring that this never happens again. So with that, I thank the committee for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Now recognize Representative Crow.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before all of you in opposition to House Resolution 1469. The chairman and I do have something in common agreement here, and that is we don't have to be here tonight. And we don't have to be here tonight because the Foreign Affairs Committee actually has a markup tomorrow. We have a scheduled markup of which we could take this resolution under consideration and have a full debate in committee. The reason why they don't want to have that markup is because they don't want to highlight publicly and before the full committee the numerous misrepresentations and gross political aspects of this resolution, of which I would be happy to outline for you today. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan. I fought the Taliban. I served as an Army Ranger. And I've often spoken about the need to take a responsible accounting of our nation's longest war. And I still believe that is very important. Not just the withdrawal, but the entirety of our nation's longest war. We owe this to all of those who swore an oath to the country, who served honorably, the hundreds of thousands of Americans who stepped up. We owe this to the 2,461 Americans who made the ultimate sacrifice and the tens of thousands of others who are wounded. We owe this to the hundreds of thousands of Afghans who stood up and fought for their freedom, who to this day continue to strive for freedom and independence. And we owe this to our constituents, the American taxpayer, who footed the bill over $2 trillion over 20 years to fund this war. It is our solemn duty, but it's a duty that spans 4 presidential administrations and 10 Congresses. However, the majority's so-called investigation has politicized this and instead tries to mischaracterize and make the story of this war about 1 month. Instead of 20 years, 1 month is what they want to look at. And they want to do it as November nears. And this report is full of false and cherry-picked information, of which I will outline for you today. Just to underscore the partisanship and the political aspect of this, Vice President Harris is referenced only 3 times in more than 3,000 pages of transcribed interviews. 3,000 pages, 18 transcribed interviews. She's only mentioned in a passing way 3 times. And yet, she's mentioned 5 times in this 7-page resolution and over 200 times in the majority's report. So a couple other issues that I think are worth mentioning here. this so-called investigation also completely fails to look at Donald Trump and the Donald Trump administration role in all of this. For example, it condemns Zalmay Khalilzad, but it says nothing about his superiors, the person who actually directed him and to whom he reported, Secretary Pompeo, or to Donald Trump himself. In fact, Donald Trump himself bragged that President Biden couldn't have stopped the withdrawal if he had wanted, and that the deal excluded the Afghan government entirely. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a copy of the Doha Agreement.
So ordered.
Thank you. Second, this does not mention the multiple unilateral troop drawdowns of former President Trump that he carried out despite the Taliban's non-compliance with this deal. And then third, it's silent on other witnesses, on facts that other witnesses testified to, including the utter lack of planning by President Trump to prepare for the full withdrawal that he initiated, the consensus in 2021 that had President Biden stopped or reversed this withdrawal, the Taliban would renew its war on American troops. In fact, I'd also ask unanimous consent to enter into the record a memorandum prepared by the minority staff that outlines all of this testimony and the witnesses to these facts.
Without objection.
So I'm going to make something really clear here. The majority in this resolution try to paint this as a picture of August 2021 as entirely the responsibility of the Biden administration. Now, I have actually been critical on numerous occasions about aspects of the withdrawal, and I continue to be. There are certainly many lessons to be learned there, and there are things that did not go well, and things that I would have liked to have done differently. But this story of this war is not about that 1 month alone. And to wrap it up into this resolution that twists and contorts and tries to politicize this issue does not do justice to the people who served and sacrificed so much. I also want to make really clear the challenges that this administration faced when it entered into office. Let me paint that picture. In January 2021, when President Biden came into office, there were the fewest number of troops, the lowest troop number he inherited since 2001. He also inherited a situation of increased Taliban aggression. To be clear, the Taliban were gaining territory in this war since 2013. In the 8 years leading up to when he took office, the Taliban were consistently gaining territory. Then every witness who was asked the question and testified to the issue of Taliban compliance or non-compliance with the deal in 2021, who were asked the question that if we were to break the deal that Donald Trump negotiated with the Taliban, what would happen? They said across the board, the Taliban would be back at war with the United States, A, and B, that we could not have responded to that effectively and protected our troops with the number of troops that we had there on the ground. So there was no status quo. The decision and the decision only they faced was to continue the withdrawal as best as possible, or to surge again and send 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 troops back into Afghanistan. We would be there fighting and dying to this day, just like the prior 20 years. That was the decision. This resolution talks about none of that and does a disservice to the people who sacrificed. Lastly, there are things that many people can do to address this issue because the story of this war is not yet over. The legacy of it is not yet over. There are bills to make sure that we can honor our allies, that we can protect the Afghans who served with us. There are bills to ensure that those Afghans who we did evacuate during the withdrawal, who have resettled here, who are trying to start their lives, can actually do so. Right? They're in many of our communities, starting businesses, thriving, but they have no path no path to a permanent life here. And bills to make sure that we can continue to reform the SIV process, to expedite it and streamline it. All of these bills, the Afghan Allies Protection Act, the Afghan Adjustment Act, the CARE Authorization Act, are ready for co-sponsors, and I welcome my Republican colleagues to co-sponsor those bills and put it up for a vote as soon as possible. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to everyone's questions, and I would urge my colleagues to oppose House Resolution 1469. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Crow. Representative Self, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member. I'm appearing today in support of H.R. 3334, the Stop CCP Act, which was introduced by our colleague from Michigan, Congresswoman McClain, and ordered favorably reported by the Committee on Foreign Affairs. The Chinese Communist Party is responsible for some of the world's most egregious human rights violations and threats to international security. Hong Kong was once known for its vibrant civil society and rule of law, but today it is under the thumb of the CCP police state, and many of the brave democracy advocates sit in jail. In Xinjiang, Uyghur Muslims live in fear of practicing their religion and culture while ongoing CCP-led genocide seeks to erase their history. People on Taiwan, a close friend of the United States, live under constant military coercion, including incursions into their air defense identification zone. An oppressive PRC Coast Guard presence keeps pushing closer and closer to Taiwan's shores. These human rights abuses and military coercion are being directed and implemented by the leaders of the Communist Party. The Central Committee, which this bill targets, is comprised of the top CCP members, who are undoubtedly complicit in this abuse and aggression that threatens our friends and partners in the Indo-Pacific. Therefore, it is critical to use targeted sanctions to hold these party leaders to account. The weakness of the Biden-Harris administration foreign policy has sadly invited aggression around the world, in Ukraine, in the Middle East, hopefully not in Taiwan. And if I get a chance, I'll cover some of their statement of administration policy. I am sorry that many of my friends on the other side of the aisle, seeing this chaos, feel that we cannot currently afford to put action to our words when it comes to CCP aggression. This bill is not an act of war. We are only ensuring that the CCP officials most responsible for these crimes do not get to enjoy the benefits of the U.S. financial system or routine travel to our great country, much as the ranking member just testified that he is not allowed to travel to theirs. Standing up for our founding values and security interests are essential. The defense of liberty and human rights is not escalation. Our partners and allies feel the safest when America leads rather than shrinking back while our adversaries are on the march. This bill is a strong display of U.S. foreign policy. It is not acquiescence, as we see routinely, and the values that guide it are the strong display. In this bill and many bills, we hear colleagues across the aisle tell us how important accountability is, and they tell us how much they value accountability. And then they say they will not hold anyone accountable. Strong words for constituents, but weak policy. I urge all members to support this bill and look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Representative Amo, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member McGovern. It's an honor to be at my first Rules Committee hearing representing Ranking Member Meeks and my colleagues on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. I'm here because I oppose this measure. While H.R. 3334 claims to be a measure that is tough on China, it's just a facade. Scratch past the surface and you'll find an unserious proposal that does not work to address our problems with Beijing. This bill does accomplish one goal. It would undermine high-level diplomacy between the United States and China. If this legislation were to become law, it would require the sanctioning of all the PRC's top leadership, including the president, premier, and senior ministers. This unilateral escalation could cause an unprecedented fissure in our relations and hinders our ability to outcompete China. Instead of strategically isolating Beijing, this misguided bill could undermine the alliances and partnerships that the Biden-Harris administration has painstakingly forged through initiatives like the Quad, AUKUS, and others. Today, we are coordinating sanctions on China with our partners and allies like never before. H.R. 3334 would undercut this unity by trying to make America go at it alone once again. This sweeping proposal gives no thought to the possible impacts on U.S. officials and businesses who may need to engage with PRC counterparts to advance our own interests. It includes an impractical waiver requirement that must be renewed every 2 months. And this authority expires after 2 years, even though the sanctions do not. Simply put, this is not the way to deal with the PRC threat. By blindly sanctioning all top leaders in one fell swoop, we negate our leverage going forward. This would detonate the U.S.-China relationship while getting absolutely nothing from China in return or any change in its malign behavior. The Biden-Harris administration recently succeeded in restarting high-level diplomacy with Beijing. Over the past year, senior state, defense, and treasury officials met with their counterparts to advance U.S. interests and advocate for the American people. The State Department is rightly concerned that H.R. 3334 would make such high-level diplomacy more difficult. It would have real-world consequences for America's interests. Let me give you some examples. Last month, the commander of Indo-PACOM spoke with his PRC counterpart for the first time in years. There was a dangerous lapse in communication between our military leaders because the defense minister of China refused to meet or speak with Secretary Austin since he had been sanctioned by the United States when he was a lower-level commander. Our military leaders have said publicly that we need open lines of communication with the People's Liberation Army to manage crises and ensure that an accident or misperception on the Taiwan Strait or the South China Sea does not escalate into a conflict. The mandatory sanctions in this bill could endanger those essential lines of communication. Second, thanks to President Joe Biden's diplomacy and bipartisan pressure from Congress, the PRC has finally agreed to restart counter-narcotics operation. This was halted after the United States placed a Chinese government institution on the entity list. While this cooperation is just getting started, we need the PRC to crack down on the illicit distribution of precursor chemicals to help stop the flow of fentanyl and save American lives. We cannot make progress on this problem if we blindly sanction China's top leaders. So in short, this bill is bad for America. It would raise the risk of our competition veering into conflict. And given the high stakes of our relationship, we need to open our eyes and work together on smarter policy. I oppose this measure, and I urge my colleagues to do the same. I welcome questions and look forward to them. Thank you.
Thank you to all of our witnesses for their thoughtful comments. I will recognize myself for questions. First to Chairman McCall. As a reminder for us, has anyone officially taken responsibility for the disastrous evacuation that led to the death of 13 U.S. service members?
None that I'm aware of, no.
And neither Joe Biden nor Kamala Harris ever reached out to the families of the 13 service members who were killed?
No, and I deal with the Gold Star families quite a bit. I think this is the point that, quite frankly, makes them angry, is their children were blown up by a suicide bomber, but they were never really recognized. There wasn't a phone call. There was never, and I'm sorry. I think at the Congressional Gold Medal, the Speaker finally said, we're sorry. The United States government, we're sorry what happened to your children. That's all they want. And yet the president is looking at his watch throughout the Dover Air Base ceremony. Quite frankly, they are very, very angry, and they have every right to be.
Well, thank you. I appreciate you restating these facts for us here today. I think it's important for every American to hear those because colleagues on the other side of the dais have a lot of problems with this very straightforward, factual resolution outlining what happened and who needs to be held accountable. Unlike our colleagues, I have a problem with an administration that oversees a disaster like this withdrawal from Afghanistan, refuses to take responsibility for what occurred, and doesn't even have the courage to meet with Gold Star families of the 13 service members who perished serving our country so admirably. This says everything the American people needs to know about how cynical and weak the Biden-Harris administration is, and I strongly support this resolution. And at this point, I would yield to the ranking member, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. McGovern, for questions.
Well, first of all, on the Afghanistan resolution, it seems to me that on something like this, that regular order would be important. That going through a committee process would be important. Because otherwise it smells of politics. The idea that it was introduced a few days ago, bypassing committee, coming to the Rules Committee to get something to the floor before we recess for an election. I mean, what is the compelling reason to not have had the Foreign Affairs Committee actually do a hearing and mark this up?
I think, and I have a lot of respect for the ranking members, you know, as well as my colleague who served in Afghanistan. The timing is important because we are going out of session this week.
Well, we're coming back right after the election.
The families want accountability. They want justice. They don't want us to wait till after the election.
Well, you waited all this time.
This is not my timeline.
Yeah.
It's a timeline of the administration who I had to fight tooth and nail, subpoena after subpoena, motions for contempt to get the witnesses and the documents I needed for my investigation. Yeah. I wish we had had this report done by summer and had the Secretary's testimony by summer. It didn't work out that way. And I don't want to go home for a month in recess without a determination of accountability from the report that we generated. Now, I'm usually a regular order guy, like you. I just think this has a compelling interest and compelling case to, based upon the findings of the report, 2 years of an investigation, documenting history, that we finally hold these people accountable.
Mr. Crow?
Mr. McGovern, the families of the fallen deserve the truth. That's what they deserve. And they deserve an honest accounting of what did and did not happen. And a resolution that says things that are patently false will not help them grieve, will not help them understand what happened, will not help the American people grapple with not just the events of August 2021, but the entirety of the 20 years, as well as the 2,460 other service members who gave their lives. They deserve the truth. And one example of that is one of the paragraphs in here says, the Biden-Harris administration's chaotic, precipitous withdrawal, and it goes on and it says, resulted in the terrorist attack by ISIS-K at Abbey Gate. There is literally nothing in the Republicans' purported investigation that proves that point. Mm-hmm. In fact, what it does show is a fundamental misunderstanding of military operations, a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation on the ground, and it actually runs contrary. Not only is there nothing to support it, but there's a ton of evidence, sworn testimony, that directly contradicts it, including multiple reviews and investigations by uniformed personnel at the DOD that had nothing to do with this withdrawal that directly contradict that point. That is not what the families and the American people deserve.
I just wish, you know, that on things like this, as sensitive as this issue is, that regular order would be adhered to, because otherwise it reeks of politics, and I think that is not comforting to the family, members, I don't know, I just think we can do better than this. And anyway, let me, Mr. Self, I have a question. I agree with Mr. Amo, and I welcome to the Rules Committee. I hope it's not your last time here, but anyway, I agree with him. I don't agree with kind of the across the board kind of blanket sanctions approach that you're taking here. But as you were speaking, I was just looking through the bill, and I was just I had the privilege of traveling with the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee not too long ago. We met with His Holiness the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala to talk about the terrible oppression by the Chinese government against the Tibetan community. And I'm noticing, maybe I'm missing something here, but there's lots of things mentioned: Taiwan, Hong Kong, the Uyghurs. There's not a mention of the Tibetans at all. Is there a reason? This went through the committee, right? This bill went through the.
It did. We have 2 Dems on it.
Yeah, but is there a reason why Tibetans are not included in any of your language here?
Well, I can't speak to that, but I will tell you the Tibetans are certainly included in their gross human rights violations.
Yeah, but they're not mentioned here, and which is startling to me, given the fact that they have been particularly oppressed for a very, very long time.
I think you'll notice that it doesn't sanction an entire class. It sanctions the people who are involved in wrongdoing, which I believe
Right, but you don't identify, so that's a different question. I mean, you don't identify the individual, the wrongdoing tied to a specific individual. You sanction kind of across the board, right, of the PRC leadership, just saying that you're all guilty of whatever. But I'm just curious why Tibet has not been, it was not at all, not even mentioned in here. And because it seems to me that the fact that it's not mentioned stands out. Again, I don't like the sanctions part of it, but the fact that Tibet is not mentioned, I'm just, is there a reason for that? Everything else was mentioned.
I think we've given you a little bit of grace here, because in the top of paragraph 9, if you'll turn to it, Mr. Ranking Member, contribute to political oppression or violation of human rights of individuals or societal groups within the People's Republic of China, including Uyghur Muslims.
Right, Uyghur
That's
Muslim,
where Tibetans are included.
But you don't mention the word Tibet or
Okay.
Tibetans. You mention Uyghur Muslim, which I'm glad you do. You talk about the people in Hong Kong, which I'm glad you do. You talk about the people in Taiwan. We have to be concerned about them as well. But I don't know. I just maybe I'm very sensitive on this issue, and the fact that it's not mentioned, I know will be interpreted by the Chinese government as purposeful, especially since it went through committee.
I suspect that we can find another societal group in China that will probably
then
be
you should mention them.
this.
But Tibetans are not just another society. They have.
Well, as soon as you come up with a specified list.
Well, you do, though. You talk about, but you mentioned Uyghur Muslims.
No, because we say here,
I'm looking
Mr.
at it right
McGovern,
here.
we say that including them, so there are other groups that could be included.
Right, but the fact that when you say including Uyghur Muslims, but not Tibetans, I'm just very sensitive on this topic, and I really think it was an
understand your
omission.
sensitivity.
But anyway, I wanted to point that out for the record. And if the Chinese government is listening, believe it, we are all committed to standing up for the human rights of the Tibetan community, Democrats and Republicans, as we've proven over and over again, and that we could just say that the omission in this was a mishap or bad staff work or clerical error or something. I don't know. We'll make something up. Anyway.
I believe the inclusion on page 9 is.
Yeah, I don't at all. But anyway, thank you. Do you want to add anything, Mr. Amo?
Well, I just think, that particular point just sort of highlights that this is an unnecessary piece of legislation. Congress has established several sanction regimes, global Magnitsky Human Rights Accountability Act, the Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the Specially Designated Nationals and Blocked Persons List, and so on and so forth. We have many mechanisms at our disposal. This particular piece of legislation, again, is escalatory for no real purpose and makes us less safe and does not contribute to those human rights aspirations that we have. And of course, there should be consequences. We have the tools at our disposal, and that's what we should be focused on.
Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Sure. Thanks, the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. I'm going to reserve my questions to the end to recognize the gentlelady from Minnesota. I have no questions. Gentlelady has no questions. The gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you. I just wanted to correct what seems like it was a misimpression where the substitute chair elicited some testimony from Chairman McCall to indicate that President Biden had not spoken with the families from the folks who were killed in Afghanistan. And I would just seek unanimous consent to introduce an article from AP dated August 29, 2021. Biden pays respects to U.S. troops killed in Afghanistan, in which it details how he met privately with the families.
That objection is ordered.
Thank you. Mr. Crow, I share your frustration with the fact that we have to deal with partisan political hit pieces here rather than genuine legislative accomplishment, especially when we've got a number of bills teed up with bipartisan support. Like you, I've been involved for almost 20 years now in trying to ensure that the U.S. honors the promises it made to our allies in Afghanistan. The folks who at great personal risk assisted our troops, assisted our government throughout that conflict, and were promised safe haven, but have struggled to receive it, whether receiving the support they need to get to this country or to have their families come to this country. Now, you mentioned a number of bills, H.R. 3808, the Afghan Allies Protection Act, H.R. 4627, the Afghan Adjustment Act, and I think you mentioned a third one.
The Care Authorization Act.
Okay. So all of these are directed at meeting the commitments that the U.S. made to these allies, are they not?
That is accurate.
And all of them are both bicameral and bipartisan, are they not?
That is true.
And there has been no action taken on them to have them become law, despite the fact that there's a long-standing unmet commitment by our government.
Well, there's been a number of us within this body, including yourself, Ms. Scanlon, who have worked very hard, who are trying to get it across the finish line. But until we get the number of co-sponsors, and frankly, most Democrats are supporting this, we need more Republican support. That is the issue. We can't get it over the finish line, and these folks languish.
Well, we welcome that support, and it would seem to be a much more productive use of this body's time. I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for questions.
Mr. Chairman, I'll be brief. Congressman Crow, thank you for your service. This war in Afghanistan began in, I think, August of 2001.
October
of 2001. It ended with the withdrawal of August of 2021. Who ordered the evacuation?
Are you talking about the go to zero order? Are you talking about the Doha agreement? Or are you talking about
the withdrawal of the troops, the closing of the bases? What administration ordered that? Was it Donald Trump's or was it Joe Biden's?
Donald Trump is the president who entered into the Doha agreement in February of 2020. That agreement bound the United States to the Taliban to go to zero. So no U.S. service members, no contractors, all U.S. personnel out of the country within 14 months of the signing of that agreement.
Agreements can be modified by the current administration. Donald Trump tell me what date that he said he would follow the same, I guess, evacuation procedures that Biden did.
So
he said he wouldn't have. He would never have done it like this. He would have gotten the Americans out first.
In fact, indeed, in January of 2021, when President Biden came into office, during the transition, the Biden administration received zero information from the Trump administration on compliance with the agreement by the Taliban, where the interagency was on the review of the impact of a potential withdrawal. So all of that had to be reviewed. So the president ordered an interagency review starting in January in 2021. At the culmination of that interagency review, in April of 2021, President Biden decided to continue the withdrawal that was started by Donald Trump and substantially accomplished by Donald Trump. So when he came into office, it was the lowest number of troops since 2001 in Afghanistan because Donald Trump had started that withdrawal already.
But Donald Trump never made the statement he would do the withdrawal like Joe Biden did. He never has said that.
Yeah, that is true because Donald Trump actually said he would do it faster and would have accomplished it in 2020. In fact, in 2020, fall of 2020,
he would have done hold on, Congressman. He would have done it. He would have withdrawn every American there, and the troops would be the last one defending it. And it's really not. I mean, you bring him into this, it makes no difference. The 20-some years that we've been in this war, there was one evacuation. Americans died. They were left there. Who made the call to leave $7 billion worth of?
That's false, actually. That number, and I will get to that. Okay, I'll explain why that's false.
But first of all, was there? Let me ask you this: was there any supplies left? You can dispute the number, but was there any supplies left, and was there $54 million in currency left?
I would be happy to address that, but I'm going to first address your question about the withdrawal. In fact, it was Donald Trump who said unequivocally that he wanted to bring all the troops home by Christmas 2020.
He did not say.
And then his command. Let me finish, sir. And then his commander said, "No, that's not going to work. That would be a disaster." Right. So then they extended it, and then the Biden administration came in. And Joe Biden extended it even further because under the Doha Agreement, under the agreement that Donald Trump negotiated, all troops were going to have to be out by spring of 2020. But the military commander said that was not plausible and not good to do because we all know that in military terms, retrograde operations, that's the military term for a withdrawal, are the riskiest, most complicated, and difficult things to do. So he listened to his commanders. They renegotiated with the Taliban to withdraw by August 2021, which is what they did.
He telegraphed what he was going to do, and he left American troops who died. That's the bottom line.
That is not true.
And he left, okay, well then I guess the resolution that Chairman McCall's doing is for people who lived. I mean, for you to make that kind of statement really is amazing.
They negotiated
I'm reclaiming my time.
And extended
I'm reclaiming my time. Mm-hmm. This administration was the administration that made the call to leave Americans there. This administration was the one that made the call to leave whatever amount of artillery, guns, SUVs in Afghanistan.
Sir, do you know where that $7 billion number comes from?
Okay, I'm going to finish I'm not going to tie this committee up. You can debate, it's been reported. I mean, you can have a different opinion. You can't have different facts.
I can tell you that number.
And so the fact is,
from South Carolina controls the time.
The fact is that this administration bears responsibility for the deaths. Just like it's interesting you said the Taliban, you made some comment about them being at war with America. They would have gone to war with America. Where the 15 million that are coming across here illegally, are they vetted to make sure there's no Taliban or terrorists? No. So this administration has blood on its hands. And this administration, with its policies, bears responsibility. And this resolution is the least we can do. Now, you can try to go back through the years where rights and wrongs were done, but there was one beginning and one withdrawal. And it does a disservice to these dead Americans, and has been reported, the material that is left there. We're a weaker nation, and we're at war now because of the actions of this administration. Do you know Congressman Corey Mills?
I do know Mr. Mills. And would you like me to answer some of the questions?
Let me just ask you.
In fact, I served with Mr. Mills in Iraq.
Do you realize who did he tell a number of people when he rescued the stranded Afghanistans as best he could, and then other countries? Who did he say was his biggest threat from this administration when he was flying over there?
Well, I'm going to take this as a rhetorical question. So if you want to tell me, that's fine. You can tell me.
No, what's your opinion?
If you'd actually allow me to answer the numerous misrepresentations, I'd be happy to do so.
Look, I'm not going to let you filibuster here because we've got other
Well, I'm not trying to filibuster.
All I'm saying is, ask him, Corey Mills, who went on the missions himself. The biggest threat, one of the biggest threats he faced was from this Biden administration shooting his plane down. He will tell you that today. And that is unbelievable coming from a patriot like Corey Mills is. But this administration has been a boondoggle, not just in this. American lives are endangered, just like the invasion at the border, that all kind of rhetoric is trying to say that Trump caused that. He did not. It's just not true. Donald Trump is not true that he said he would do the exact evacuation that Joe Biden did. He said he'd get the Americans out first, and they would be protected. So it's amazing we're having to even debate this resolution.
Would you like me to address any of the questions or any of the issues you raised?
You know, it's just rhetoric. Not really, because...
Okay, well, I'd be happy to correct the record and explain to you the misrepresentations in this that you're going to vote for.
I'm not, it's no consequence. Ms. McCall, would you like to address some of these? I mean, you're the ones that's...
Yeah, I'd like to maybe clean up the record if I can. First of all, the Doha Agreement. How many agreements did the Biden administration tear up? How many?
There is no...
JCPOA, remain in Mexico, yet this was ever binding upon them. But the fact of the matter is, to your point, the way the Doha Agreement worked was that the Taliban had to be in compliance with the conditions to the agreement. The conditions were being violated. That is, they didn't cut their ties with al-Qaeda. That's obvious because Zawahiri, the number 2 guy, was in the arms of the Taliban when he was taken out by a drone strike. You know, number 2, they couldn't hit our troops in Afghanistan. They were violating that. They were violating just about every condition, which is precisely why Donald Trump kept the troops there. So he can say it's all Trump's fault, but the record speaks and the facts speak louder than his rhetoric. Because when Trump left office, there were 2,500 troops there and 6,500 NATO, all of which, according to the testimony of General Milley, McKenzie, and Miller, the top 3 generals, was sufficient with air cover and contractors to provide stability to Afghanistan. In other words, it would not have collapsed the way it did. And that was a record that we found from all the top generals, all the top intelligence community, that number was sufficient. My colleague, who I respect, says that, you know, General Miller told them, you know, that keeping troops meant sending more troops. That's false. General Miller said 2,500. And so the fact is, Trump left it stable. Biden came in, and this is really important, according to his team, say the Doha Agreement is immaterial to my decision here to go to 0. What does go to 0 mean? Go to 0 means 0 troops. It means 0 air cover, and it means 0 contractors. Now, I have a lot of respect for Jason. He co-chaired our investigation. He knows better than anybody, if you go to 0, the Afghan military didn't have a chance in hell. They didn't have a prayer. And this thing was going to fall, and it was going to fall fast. And the sad thing is the State Department never came forward with a plan of evacuation as required by federal law until the Taliban invaded and took over Kabul. By that time, it's too late. Our embassy is in chaos. The airport's in chaos. Americans are left behind. American citizens had to go through the Taliban checkpoints to get to the airport. How many Americans do you think were turned back by the Taliban? This chaos, this environment of disaster and destruction and death was created by this failure on the part of the people named in my resolution.
And it was done by this administration. This is the same administration when the balloon, the Chinese balloon that flew over this country and flew over South Carolina. I was there when the generals at this administration said, actually quoted, the Chinese hierarchy did not know about it. They literally said that, which, again, is bizarre. And Donald Trump is on record, Congressman Crow, you can put in I would like for you to give me the date and time that Donald Trump agreed to the withdrawal as Biden directed, because I don't think it's there.
Can I
very quickly? I'm not going to filibuster. You can dispute
I'm not looking
everything.
to filibuster. My name has been invoked several times, and I feel compelled. In fact, I think this committee has an obligation to allow me to respond to the things that have been said.
Up to a point.
Mm-hmm.
Just
can I have some time to respond?
No, I'm not going to.
Okay.
They say this was a success. Really?
Yeah.
Really. And what's the fallout here? Americans left behind. Thousands of ISIS-K are released from Bagram, some of whom have found their way into this country. That's the fallout. What else? Putin invades Ukraine. Chairman Xi threatens the Pacific. The Ayatollah raises his ugly head. Projection of weakness invites aggression, conflict, and war. This was the beginning of a failed foreign policy.
Weakness and appeasement. Thank you all for testifying. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back. Chair thanks the gentleman. The gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Crow, we heard several statements that didn't seem to comport with what happened on the ground. It seems to me like Trump negotiated a pretty bad agreement, and then they want to forget about that. And the idea that Trump left it all stable. Why don't you respond to some of the issues that you just heard?
Well, thank you, Ms. Ledger-Fernandez. First of all, I mean, this proceeding is another example. They literally don't want to talk about the issue, and they don't want to hear from people who have facts that would run contrary, right? They cherry-picked facts from their purported investigation. They make claims in this hearing and then don't allow me to respond to them. They are doing it through the Rules Committee instead of having a hearing that we could hold tomorrow, because we actually have a scheduled hearing tomorrow, and we could have this debate. So they just don't want the truth, and that's pretty clear. But a couple of things that I think are really important, and there's more than we have time to dispel. But a couple of things. I did not co-chair the investigation. I was the ranking member of the Oversight and Accountability Subcommittee on the Foreign Affairs Committee. This is the subcommittee that the majority established to conduct the bulk of the investigation, or their purported investigation into Afghanistan. And as the ranking member of that subcommittee, I never saw a draft report. In fact, I didn't see the report until it was publicly released. I had no say in their report, nor did they ever at any time engage with any of the minority staff or members in putting the report together. So that's just one illustration of many as to how this is a partisan hit job and not an effort to try to get to the truth. And that's the fact. And no, Afghanistan was not stable in January 2021. Not only were there the lowest number of U.S. troops since 2001, but the Taliban had been advancing and taking territory since 2013. In fact, the U.S. military commander, General Scott Miller, in charge of all U.S. troops for the years leading up to 21 and during, testified that it was, quote, a slow bleed, end quote. We were losing. And Joe Biden had only two options left. Donald Trump gave him only two options because he didn't have enough troops on the ground. And all the military commanders said very clearly that if he had broken the Trump agreement with the Taliban, an agreement, by the way, that Donald Trump negotiated without the Afghan government, that gave no talk or no allocation for human rights or the rights of women, doesn't speak about that at all in the agreement, and actually says that the Afghan government had to release 5,000 Taliban prisoners. That's what Trump agreed to. That further destabilized the situation on the ground. That's what Joe Biden was facing. Either go back to war with the Taliban and surge troops in, however many, 10,000, 15,000, 20,000.
Let me just ask a question. So Trump negotiated agreement that called for the release of the Taliban prisoners.
Correct.
And when were they released?
They were released, they started to be released in 2020.
Right, so they were released under Trump.
Correct.
So Trump negotiated an agreement that releases all of these Taliban prisoners
Correct.
into society. From what you're telling me, Trump negotiates an agreement that brings down the troops to a slow bleed to very dangerous levels for the rest of the American troops. Is that what I'm understanding?
That's right.
Okay, so those are the facts of what was happening during Trump. It was not stable, is what you've now described.
Donald Trump's agreement agreed to the closure of bases, the reduction of troops and contractors, the release of Taliban prisoners, gave no accommodation whatsoever or requirement for human rights or the protection of women and girls, and completely excluded the Afghan government from those negotiations.
And does this resolution make reference to any of Trump's excellent negotiating skills in terms of, that sounds like a pretty lousy negotiating deal for America?
It simply references the agreement, but it talks about none of the components we just talked about.
So, and are there any other elements that you want to correct with regards to the exchange that has taken place?
Yeah, one other thing, one of your colleagues mentioned something about $7 billion of weapons and equipment that were left behind. That number actually is the entirety of U.S. military weapons and equipment given to the Afghan National Security and Defense Forces over the entire 20 years of the war, right? Much of it destroyed in combat, much of it beyond its useful life, much of it left unserviceable after contractors and servicing and maintenance were not provided for. That is the entirety. So to take that number and to say that what was left in the hands of the Taliban is just completely misleading.
So the statement about the $7 billion, that was given to the Afghanis, so it was no longer our equipment? Is that what I'm understanding?
That's right. In fact, General Milley and General Miller testified very clearly during the transcribed interviews that the United States military took all of its equipment with them.
Is there anything else that you want to correct in the record?
Well, there's more than I think we have time for this evening, but certainly that's a good start.
There's no clock in the Rules Committee.
You're sure? This is it. This is the last Democrat that gets to ask questions.
This notion that the withdrawal, by the way, a lot of the challenges of the withdrawal, many of them, occurred because President Ghani fled the country. After President Ghani fled the country, which nobody anticipated, by the way, nobody thought that was going to happen. And I've spent much of my adult life either serving in Afghanistan, focused on Afghanistan issues. Nobody saw that coming. And then that led to the precipitous collapse of the Afghan military and the police forces, which then led to a very challenging withdrawal environment in that month. But there's no evidence that shows that the situation on the ground and the challenges at the airport in August of 2021 were avoidable. And that or let me be clear, that the attack on Abbey Gate and the death of those 13 members was avoidable. In fact, the Department of Defense's own investigation showed very clearly that there was never a positive ID of the bomber, and nobody knew who that person was. And the majority's assertion that reliance on the Taliban to run checkpoints is somehow related to that ignores the reality that the Taliban and the ISIS are actually sworn mortal enemies and continue to try to kill each other to this day. And in fact, the reliance on Taliban checkpoints made our troops safer, because instead of having to guard the outer perimeter and maintain those checkpoints, we were able to be in an inner perimeter. So these are many, many things that are false or misleading in this resolution, and I would urge my colleagues to not support it.
Thank you. I think that anytime we have the loss of life, and especially in incidents like that, it's very sad and it's hard for the country. It is unfortunate when it gets used in such a partisan and politicized manner like this. With that, Mr. Chair, I will yield back.
I don't know if I'm moving up or down.
Always moving up.
Thank you. I have a tremendous amount of respect for you, Jason, and obviously you, sorry, Congressman Crow and Congressman McCall, the other congressman as well, but I am going to focus on Afghanistan. A lot's been said about President Trump's Doha agreement. Did you know this? How many lives did we lose after the Doha agreement?
After the Doha agreement, the one component of the Doha agreement that the Taliban did comply with?
We lost 4 in 2020. Is that correct? We lost 4 after the Doha agreement in 2020.
You're talking about service member lives? You're talking about contractor lives?
I'm talking about service member lives. It was 4, I believe. We didn't lose anybody in 2021 until the Abbey Gate incident.
Right. That's
so
true.
The criticism about the Doha agreement, ultimately, the Doha agreement led to a significant reduction in lives lost. Now, if we're talking about all the facts of Afghanistan, the number of lives being lost, obviously 1 is a lot, but it had been reduced over the last several years to the tens and the 20s, and certainly my heart goes out to any of them. But going back to the Doha agreement, which Donald Trump agreed to, there were only 4 lives lost after that, up to and until Abbey Gate. And so my whole issue with the withdrawal, and this gets back to what General McKenzie said, in testimony in HASC, an open testimony, I'll give you my honest opinion, and my honest opinion view shaped my recommendation to the President then being Joe Biden. I recommended that we maintain 2,500 troops in Afghanistan. Now you were there. I mean, you're a Ranger. I mean, 2,500 troops would have let us maintain Bagram Airfield. Is that?
I disagree with that.
Okay. Well, I respect you. Yep. But 2,500 troops. And I also recommended earlier in the fall of 2020 that we maintain 4,500 troops at that time. You're familiar with this testimony?
I am familiar with that testimony, yes.
I also have a view that the withdrawal of those forces would lead inevitably to the collapse of the Afghanistan military force and eventually the Afghan government. My issue with the whole thing is that the advice of the military commanders was ignored. And had the advice of the military commanders not been ignored, I do not believe Afghanistan would have collapsed the way it did. I absolutely believe the Taliban would have played a role in the governing of Afghanistan in the future, just as they have for decades. But it is a, and I agree with you that Ghani leaving was a big part. Him abandoning his country was a big part of the collapse. But I don't understand how there has not been more discussion about President Biden ignoring the advice of General McKenzie. And I can tell you, as somebody who was at NATO the week that Russia moved into Ukraine, our NATO partners made it very clear to us there was no discussion from the U.S. with our partners. It was just a statement. We're leaving on this day. Good luck. And so, I mean, I think President Biden and Vice President Harris deserve to be. I think the public needs to know that they had ignored the advice of their military commanders, and I think the public needs to know that they did not have discussions with our partners at NATO. And so I won't keep you here any longer. I agree with you when you said Ghani leaving was a big part of it, 100%. But to blame President Trump for Doha, after he signed Doha, we lost 4 lives until the Abbey Gate. And my heart goes out to all of them. But with that, I don't have any questions on the other issue, and I appreciate both of you on this issue and just differences of opinion. I yield. Thanks. And I think y'all can. We're done. Thank you for appearing before us today. Y'all are excused.
All right,
Yeah.
eventful, as always, eventful, as always.
Well, you know, they go to zero is why Donnie left. Go to zero, just left it in shambles, right? Yeah, yep.
Well, to your point, actually, I actually agree with you that it was dope.
Trump who withdrew from the JCPOA.
Yeah, but they
did stop.
they're getting back into it.
No, they didn't.
Or they could.
No, they didn't.
Man,
Biden tried to get back into it.
yeah, you're right. There are other agreements. You're right.
Yeah, well, that was a huge issue.
All right. Chair would like to welcome the third panel, Representative Fitzgerald and Ranking Member Nadler from the Committee on the Judiciary to the witness table. Representative Fitzgerald, I welcome your testimony. Whoops. Wait until he sits down.